did not just write songs, he documented the human condition, often without realizing it. And perhaps that is the final irony. The man who spent his life singing about connection had to walk through loneliness to understand it. The man who brought happiness to millions had to lose everything familiar to finally find peace. And in the end, Neil Diamond's greatest achievement wasn't fame, fortune, or records sold. It was truth. Before we continue, take 1 second to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss more real stories like this. As Neil Diamond moved into the later stages of his career, something unusual happened. Instead of fading quietly into nostalgia, his music took on a new weight. The melodies were still powerful, still familiar, but the emotions beneath them were heavier, more reflective. Fame had given him everything he once dreamed of: money, recognition, legacy, but it had also taken years he could never get back. And slowly, the cost of that trade became impossible to ignore. By the 1980s and 1990s, Diamond was no longer just competing with other artists. He was competing with his own past. Every concert was measured against legendary performances. Every new album was judged against classics that had already shaped generations. For someone as self-critical as Neil Diamond, this pressure was relentless. He wasn't chasing applause anymore, he was chasing meaning. During this period, his relationships continued to reflect the imbalance in his life. Neil married and divorced multiple times, each relationship beginning with hope and ending in emotional distance. Those close to him later revealed that Diamond struggled to be fully present. Even when he was physically there, part of him remained elsewhere, thinking about music, legacy, expectations, and the constant fear of losing relevance. Love required vulnerability, and vulnerability was something he had spent his entire career hiding behind songs. At the same time, the public image of Neil Diamond was becoming almost mythic. He was no longer just a singer, he was an institution. Sweet Caroline had become a cultural anthem, sung at sports stadiums and celebrations by people who didn't even know its origin. The song took on a life of its own, detached from the man who wrote it. Ironically, while the world used his music to feel united, Diamond himself often felt more isolated than ever. Behind the scenes, his health issues were quietly resurfacing. Years of intense touring had taken a physical toll. Chronic pain, fatigue, and mobility issues became part of his daily reality. Yet he continued to perform, pushing his body far beyond what most people would consider safe. Not because he was greedy for fame, but because music was the only place where his pain felt useful. On stage, suffering transformed into connection. Neil Diamond's relationship with depression also deepened during these years. Unlike temporary sadness, depression followed him like a shadow, sometimes quiet, sometimes overwhelming. Therapy helped him understand that much of his drive came from a fear of stillness. Silence forced him to confront emotions he had avoided since childhood. As long as he was working, writing, touring, he didn't have to face the emptiness. In the early 2000s, Diamond experienced a powerful career resurgence. New generations discovered his music, and longtime fans returned in massive numbers. His concerts sold out again, and his voice, though older, carried a raw honesty that made performances even more emotional. Many fans described his shows as spiritual experiences, moments of collective release. What they didn't realize was that Neil himself was often barely holding together behind the curtain. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 2018, Neil Diamond publicly revealed that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. For the first time in his career, the truth could no longer stay hidden. Parkinson's is a progressive neurological disorder that affects movement, balance, and coordination, everything a performer depends on. The diagnosis explained years of physical struggles that fans had noticed but never understood. The announcement shocked the world. For decades, Neil Diamond had been the symbol of strength and endurance. Now, he was admitting vulnerability on a global scale. With the diagnosis came a heartbreaking decision. He would retire from touring. No farewell spectacle, no dramatic final performance, just a quiet acknowledgement that his body could no longer keep up with his spirit. For Neil Diamond, this was more than the end of touring. It was the collapse of the identity he had built since his teens. Performing wasn't just a job. It was how he processed pain, how he connected with others, how he survived. Losing the stage felt like losing his voice, even though he could still sing. The silence he had feared his entire life finally arrived. Yet something unexpected happened after the diagnosis. Without the constant pressure to perform, Diamond began to experience a different kind of clarity. He focused more on songwriting, reflection, and personal relationships. He leaned into therapy not as a survival tool, but as a way to understand who he was beyond fame. For the first time, he wasn't running from himself. His marriage to Katie McNeil, significantly younger than him, became one of the most stabilizing relationships of his life. Unlike previous marriages shaped by chaos and absence, this partnership was built during a period of honesty and acceptance. Parkinson's forced Neil Diamond to be vulnerable in ways he never had before, and vulnerability, ironically, became his greatest strength. The public also began to see him differently. No longer just the smiling hitmaker, Neil Diamond was now viewed as a survivor. Fans didn't love him less because of his illness, they loved him more. His honesty gave permission to others to confront their own struggles without shame. Still, the double life didn't disappear overnight. Even in retirement, Diamond wrestled with identity, purpose, and fear of irrelevance. When your entire existence has been defined by applause, learning to live without it is a slow, painful process. Some days were peaceful. Others were filled with grief for the life he used to live. Yet, through it all, music remained his quiet companion. He continued to write, not for charts or stadiums, but for himself. The songs became softer, more reflective, less about bringing people together, and more about understanding what it means to be human when the spotlight fades. Neil Diamond's story was never just about fame. It was about endurance, about giving joy while quietly surviving pain, about smiling for the world while fighting battles no one could see. And the final truth was becoming clear. The double life he lived for 30 years wasn't a lie, it was a coping mechanism. In the final chapter of Neil Diamond's life, what stands out most is not what he lost, but what he finally gained. After decades of chasing perfection, applause, and validation, he learned how to sit with imperfection. Parkinson's disease forced him to stop performing, but it did not silence his purpose. Instead, it stripped away the noise and left behind something far more honest, a man no longer hiding behind success. Neil Diamond today represents a rare kind of courage, the courage to step away when the world still wants more, the courage to admit weakness after spending a lifetime being strong for everyone else, and the courage to redefine success not as sold-out stadiums, but as inner peace. His story reminds us that fame does not heal childhood wounds, applause does not replace love, and achievement does not automatically bring happiness. What makes his journey unforgettable is the contrast. A man whose songs united millions spent years feeling emotionally alone. A voice that sounded confident carried decades of quiet pain. And yet, instead of becoming bitter, Neil Diamond turned that pain into art, songs that continue to comfort people long after he left the stage. This is why his legacy will never fade, not because of records sold or awards won, but because his music tells the truth about being human, about longing, love, loss, endurance, and hope. Neil Diamond lived a double life for many years, but in the end, he chose truth over performance, honesty over illusion, and peace over applause. And that choice, made quietly, without fanfare, maybe the most powerful song he ever wrote.